Hello, everyone, and welcome to Classical Revolution. My name is Rachel Fenlon, and for those of you just joining for the first time today, a little bit about the series. This series focuses on the whys and why nots when it comes to classical music, creativity in classical music, boundary pushing. We wanted to talk about what is revolutionary in music and why and when. I am so excited to introduce my special guest today. When I first got asked to do this series, he was one of the first people I knew I wanted to interview. First of all, because I'm a huge fan, unabashedly a huge fan of all of his music, and especially his chamber music. For me, I really adore it. And you know, Nico is one of the rare composers who seems equally at home in grand opera, in film music, and in chamber music. He's written over 100 works for the concert stage, including commissions for the Metropolitan Opera, English National Opera, LA Phil, Carnegie Hall, the Tallis Scholars, Cambridge Choir. Nico has an extensive discography. He's actually a co-founding member of the collective Bedroom Community. So without further ado, I want to welcome Nico. Hi, Nico.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Nico, I love to start the series with just asking my guests what their introductions to music were, what their earliest interactions with music were, and what sort of sparked that lifelong passion for music.
Sure. So I had a slightly unconventional one specifically for an American, where I was studying piano in the kind of boring way that kids study the piano, but then simultaneously I was singing in a boys choir. So I was maybe 10 or 11, and basically I had this very my choir master had a really interesting path through musical rep, and I think like a lot of Anglican traditions, it's sort of, from the 1500s until about 1720, and then you stop until Herbert Howells or something. So it was the music, it was the sort of Tudor and Renaissance and Jacobean music that really hit me in that tradition. And then with piano music, I found myself drawn towards Bach and much more towards earlier things. And I remember really specifically, I wasn't particularly talented at either, but then I remember really specifically at one point everything clicked. And I just became really interested, not just in interpreting that music, or interpreting as as much as a 10-year-old can, but actually writing it.
Amazing. And so then you went on, and what were your first encounters with composition like, and when did you first start writing, and how were you first commissioned as a composer?
Well, those things happen many decades apart.
Yeah.
I started writing when I was maybe 11 or 12, and I was writing things for the church, and little choral pieces and organ pieces. And then it wasn't until I was about 13 or 14 that I realized that being a composer was a thing that was distinct from composing. So it went from being, and I think that's true of all musicians, right? Is that I play the piano, and then you turn into a pianist. There's this kind of noun to, or verb to noun transition. So for me, it was kind of a slow one. I would say at the beginning of high school, and the place that really solidified it for me was Tanglewood, actually. So I went to the Boston University Tanglewood Institute, which is like a high school program linked up with Tanglewood, which of course is the summer home of the Boston Symphony, and it's a long of a glib shorthand. I mean, all through school, it was about figuring out how I wanted to relate to the the way that classical music was made and commissioned, and what it meant to be a contemporary composer at that time was something very much in flux. And I think that, we're talking about 1997, 98, 99, when it became clearer and clearer that there were so many of us, and it wasn't going to be the case that an orchestra was just going to call you up and say, write a symphony, right? So it was this kind of DIY thing that we all kind of happened into.
Right. So interesting. There's this wonderful interview where you talk of an artist in society, and you say that there are two roles. One is for beauty, and you compare that to opera, and you say the other is for function, and compare it to choral music or film music, for example. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also particularly
on sides of the, I mean, I to I would not, I don't want to say the majority of people, but I think the thing that you can aim for, which will be the most satisfying, is to make a really good comprehensive piece of theater. And obviously a lot of people who go to the opera go for very different reasons, right? Some people go there for one singer, and some people go because they love the director, and some people go because they love leaving the house on Thursdays. And there are a lot of different reasons why people are there. So there is an element of function to that too, right? I don't think that it's necessarily like this kind of pure art thing. But having the advantage of having grown up with the kind of music making that's purely functional, and I'm talking about sacred music that exists by definition outside of the concert hall and outside of traditional performance times, and inside a completely different time frame of when you're listening to this music, why you're listening to this music, a much longer tradition, also in some cases of music making, in terms of the concerts being a relatively recent development. And so for me, that what I still kind of relish is my connection to that music, because when you think about it, for instance, nobody claps in church, right? Nobody really, this architecture of an emotional suggestion that you look upwards, right? That you sort of follow the sound up, and you follow the incense up. And so the composer sort of erases herself in that way. Whereas with concert music, you think, there on wrote it, and there is this focus on, how many people are coming. It's this kind of butts and seats anxiety. Whereas I feel like in sacred music, that stuff is secondary, tertiary, and so on and so forth. So I think there's an element of function to that appeals, and an element of the composer not necessarily needing to be in the forefront of any of that.
right. Yeah, I mean, you've written now 2 operas, is that correct?
3, actually, two grand and 1 chamber.
Okay, and what sort of draws you? I mean, of course they come from a commission, but what draws you to putting together an opera? And, or rather, I mean, you talk about how in opera I'm thinking of Your Two Boys, which is a piece that's so much based in reality. And how does your approach to a piece like opera differ from
anything else? Yeah, I mean, opera for me is it's a completely different ecosystem of, I mean, if we want to get really nerdy about it, with the big struggle for me as a composer is structure, right? Like, what you're being asked to do is take, if the commission's like, oh, it's 20 minutes, and you think, okay, what you're literally being asked to do is create 20 minutes that's preferable to 20 minutes of silence, right? Like, so, and you know, you have to figure out a structure to make that hang together. So for a chamber piece, let's pretend that you say, okay, it's going to be medium and then slow and then very, we all like that. If it's a song cycle, you can say, okay, it's 5 miniatures. You can say it's one long, but with opera, what you have is a libretto, which itself lays out a dramatic structure. Now, I'm speaking completely specifically to my own experience, and I would also just like to add that just because I'm saying that this is what worked for me doesn't mean that you know, I don't want to say structureless, but operas that don't have plots that are traditional have no validity, because I mean, for me, it's like Einstein on the Beach, you know, all the early glass operas, Meredith Monk's, you know, there's so much non-narrative opera that I adore, but it's just, I haven't written one. But anyway, so with opera, you have this pre-existing structure of the libretto. So then your job is to be in dialogue with this thing, and in counterpoint with this thing, and holding hands with this thing, and fighting this thing, and it's the challenge is it takes place in much slower motion, and to a certain extent your collaboration with the librettist is this constant state of zooming in and out of the story, right? So you say, okay, what's the one sentence version of this story, right? So in Two Boys, it's you know, a young boy convinces an older boy of a series of lies in order to make himself feel seen. Whatever, you know, you can say what you can, you know, those things can change, but that is the one sentence version that Craig Lucas and I worked on. And then from there you zoom in and say, okay, what happens in Act 1? Okay, what happens in Scene 4? Okay, what happens in this phrase? So it's a hyper version of what you would do for symphonic or chamber music, where you've got this superstructure and then a million substructures. It's thrilling and it's so fun. But you also have this question of how much does the music need to do at every single junction, where sometimes you find, or sometimes I found myself mirroring the libretto too strictly, right? Where it was like, clearly we would see something happening and then we were hearing someone talk about it, and then the music was doing it, and the singing was doing it, and the orchestra was doing it, and the video is doing it, and then you end up with like quadrupled beats. So that's always the challenge in opera, which is, you know, less of a problem in symphonic work, for instance.
Right, and then with film, which you have also a lot of experience writing for, I mean, then this is a completely different process as well.
Yes, well, with film, I mean, with opera, what's actually really crazy to me is that the score is driving the car the whole time, right? The score is this master text that is, I don't want to say infallible, of course, because that's not in any way what I'm saying, but the score is definitely the motor behind all other decisions. And, you know, even in the craziest productions where, you know, everyone's covered in blood and hanging upside down from the ceiling, and, you know, but even in those things, the score is what the master text is, right? That's the kind of the big document. Whereas with the film, actually, the score is the last thing that happens usually, right? So everything else has happened. And then the score is, it's a combination of a cleanup job and you know, it's the most important thing at that time, right? Because you're making all these decisions that can completely change the scope of everything, right? So if you're looking at a scene between two people and you put like a harmonic on one little glance, you know, suddenly you're saying that they're all going to die. But then also, you know, you're not just reacting artistically, it's this constant negotiation between the director and 97,000 producers and, you know, whoever all is in the room. So film to me, also, I should say, film takes place on such a compressed time scale compared to opera. Because opera, they're like, you know, you get the commission, they're like, see you in 4 years, you know, whereas film, you have like 6 weeks or something to do the whole thing. So or, you know, 2 months. So it's crazy. It's a whole different world.
And it's a huge undertaking. I mean, the music in a film kind of, I mean, okay, we're musicians, but it sets the emotional tone.
Of course it does, yeah. And you think that, you know, sometimes it's not just the music that sets it up, but it's the lack of music, right? And there, so,
Yes.
and it's not just what the music is, but how the music is used, and that's
Yep.
really interesting in as a composer to sort of refocus refocus your mind on the placement of these things rather than just how beautiful they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So interesting. Nico, you're a beautiful writer, and for those of you who don't know that, you have a blog, and I actually have read it for some years, or I read it I think first about 3 or 4 years ago.
Cool. I haven't updated it in a very long time.
Yeah, actually, I noticed that recently. And one of the first articles of yours that I read was about it's called Being Well, and it's on mental health and the kind of stigma that comes with it, especially in the classical music industry, or that we don't address it so much. And I thought it really spoke to me, and I think it spoke to a lot of people because people forwarded me to read the article. And I mean, the reason I bring it up is so something that I am talking about with my guests here on the series is when like self-doubt and uncertainty are good for music making. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, so for example, there are times that curiosity can be hindered because of like mental wellness. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and whether there have been moments of self-doubt and uncertainty that have actually been good for music making, or when it's hindered the musical process.
Right. That's an interesting way to frame it. That's a very good question. I haven't thought about it in that specific way. So let me sort of formulate. I mean, I would say that, one of the challenges of spending so much time alone as a composer, right? By necessity, you write alone, is that a little thing that feels, let me say this a better way. The act of writing is letting a little germ turn into a big thing, like a little cell turning into a huge structure, right? And I use those words both in their musical terms and in their medical terms and in their,
yes.
And that's amazing, right? And it's like when you have 2 notes or 4 notes and then suddenly you can construct a 30-minute thing out of it. The flip side of that is that any doubt that you have, any feeling of internal whatever, is subjected to that same process, right? Any sense of imposter syndrome, I find, metastasizes in a very similar way to a really good idea, except that it happens to be a really bad and self-destructive idea. And I think that in that sense, the genitive urge never stops, right? It's just about inputting the right thing into that process. So I mean, we're speaking now in a time of great uncertainty, right? Where, and for me right now, the thought that's so pervasive is, we've all had work canceled, right? And some of us have had a lot of work canceled, and some people have had, a million small things canceled, and some people have had the biggest thing of their life canceled. And it makes one doubt the value of what we're doing, right? It's very easy to say, well, we've all chained ourselves to this craft, and we've all sacrificed our entire childhoods, like to learn how to do whatever it is, right? If it's the marimba, or if it's right. And so there's this sense of this devaluation of what we're doing, where it's like, did it ever exist in the first place? Did it mean anything, right? Did all that work just vanish? And is it that invisible that it's not just a concert that's canceled, but it's 90 million hours of work that led to that moment, right? That it's memorizing some fakakta Korngold thing, and that it's like that there's been this anyway. So those things are really difficult, and I think it's really about figuring out how you're wired inside, to temper those doubts, and to try to make sure that they don't enter the machine of the creative, that'll turn them into like whatever the symphony of doubts and self-loathing is. And I think,
Yes.
I think for some people it's a lot easier to be rational about it. And one of the reasons I wrote that piece was that this article, which is from probably 2015,
Mhm.
and I realized that I had sort of two things going on, and one of them was a sort of boring chemical thing, which was just like being bipolar, and that's like, it's like having a disease that does a certain thing to your mind and
Yeah.
functions in a series of ways. And then there was other stuff, right? That was I think a lot of the emotions that we all share as human beings. But I had never been able, because it all felt like it was boiling at the same time. I'd never been able to separate out kind of what was what, and
Mhm.
or winnow kind of the chemical from the emotional. So dealing with that, I think, as a musician was really, really important. And I encourage, if there are musicians listening, that a lot of our preoccupations can be divided into pretty clear piles of, this is something going on that's chemical, that's kind of fizzing in your brain, and then this other thing of us letting the creative urge turn something small into something really big.
Yeah.
Does that make
I-
sense? Sorry, that was a kind of
No, it absolutely makes sense. It makes me think that there, do you think that there's a way that the classical music industry itself could um, kind of address this, or not address it, because of course but rather there feels somehow, because we're in an industry that feels somehow endangered, or there's a lot that goes along with being a classical musician, that there would be a way where we would remove some kind of, or stigma with that. Or rather, I suppose, what am I trying to say? It's that it's sometimes it's just a subject that's difficult to talk about within our industry, for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. And I think the trick, I mean, for me, again, just speaking incredibly personally here,
yeah,
just talking about it was really helpful. And I feel
yeah,
like it was nice for me to hear that it was helpful for other people, just to say, like, it might seem like I'm doing really well, but that's actually not true. And that's
right.
okay. You know what I mean? Like, I'm so, and I think I would, I mean, I think the stigma, it's a little different, with composers and with performers, in as much as, and I hate this, by the way, that there's a kind of mad scientist
Right.
fetish with
Yes.
composers. That's, whereas I can imagine, if for a composer there's a sign of kind of artistic probity and being slightly crazy, whereas for a singer you think, well, if I like come out as having kind of psychological issues, like I'll never get hired again, because they assume that I'll be, like railing trazodone off of my dressing room mirror or something, so it's like, which, by the way, we've all been there. But it's I don't know, but I think talking about it more is a good idea. And I think, just, I mean, it's also very culturally, I mean, when I wrote that piece, I realized it's so funny, because, in in New York, right, you meet someone at a dinner party, and within 2 seconds, it's like, who's your shrink and how much do you pay for rent?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, oh, you see Dr. Rosenfeld too? Whereas, like, try that in London and see what happens.
Oh gosh.
Can you imagine? So it's, I mean, I think to a certain extent, it's just about like a willingness to kind of talk about it within the cultural norms of wherever it is that you're talking about.
Also, exactly. And then, of course, if you have a blog or the internet, or
Yeah.
who doesn't have the internet, but
Yeah.
then for whatever platform you have, then you can speak about it if you.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think honestly, like, Facebook has been great about this, and I think,
Oh yeah.
I've been interested in, again, it's like, there's something slightly lurid about how honest people can be on Facebook, but right now, I actually really do want to know what my friends are going through, and I think
Yeah.
for a lot of people, it's easier to write it out and say, here's what I'm struggling with. And in a lot of cases, it's really mundane stuff, right? Where it's like my 3-year-old daughter just like threw flour all over the floor. And I'm like, that's you know, I want to know that. And then others, it's like, I'm scared that I'll never work again. You know, I'm on a thread, just a chat thread with a couple composers and pianist friends, and you know, we're all having very straightforward conversations about these worries. And I think that's just really helpful to talk about it, even if your worry is, you know, I think my sourdough starter is messed up, or I'm pretty sure I'll never get hired until the end of time.
Right. So, yeah.
Sorry to be so real, but like,
just hearing
that's where we are. Okay.
I know. Oh, yeah, it's the elephant in the room. Yeah. So it's like you say, it's having that community as well, which is something that I've heard you speak about in interviews as well. Is how pivotal that's been for you to create a community.
And I would say, I mean, this is going back to what we started with. Actually, I think the big thing that took me from kind of music student to actually getting work was not, I don't want to say a detour, but it was learning that the phone is not going to ring and be an orchestra asking for something huge. But what's actually going to happen is, if you write for your friends, if you find your family, right? If you find your tribe, and you know, whoever that is, you just write them a bunch of music. And you make that music together as a community. That's the music that will then get noticed by other people, right? So that's how it gets bigger. And in a lot of cases for a composer, one of the most dangerous things is if your music is only presented in the context of other contemporary music, right? Where there's always this kind of sad, like, I don't want to say sad, but there's always a separate kind of contemporary music department where, you know, whereas if I were to write you something, for instance, the people who would hear it would be people who like you, right? And it would be contextualized in whatever else you were doing on your recital, rather than contextualized in the sense of here are 8 pieces of contemporary music, you know. And those concerts, as you well know, are just people moving gongs from one side of the stage to the other, and then like 6 minutes of terrible music between the gongs. It's like, and I know you've been there.
Gongs. There are
always the gong. And why does it have to move? Just keep it there. It's like,
it's so true.
Or get 2 gongs.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I found that super interesting to read that about when I was listening to earlier interviews of yours of talking about that community. And yeah, because you can ask, how do you break certain traditions? And that's definitely something I think a composer like you has done, where you really like move between the lines in the industry, for sure. And interesting to hear about how that was in a way organically because of your
completely. And I think you can't, I think you can't plan it. I mean, I know I certainly didn't plan.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny too, because occasionally I'll get, people will write to me and say, you know, I want to do that. And I think, well, you know, if you plan it out, that's not how it's going to work. Like I never had like a list of goals where I said, okay, I want to do this and then this kind of commission. And this, it was much more building things out from a small idea to a big idea. And that's always what I tell younger composers and younger musicians who are interested in contemporary work, where it's like, don't wait for Carnegie to call you and be like, we're going to make you a star. Instead, you know, work with your friends and build up a body of work that itself has its own kind of radiance. And it's not about like, you must write ballet or you must write a film score. It's just about saying yes to whatever's around you.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I suppose if you're writing for your friends and colleagues, then there's this sort of energy that exists between them and the music as well. And it also makes it special. And it's easier to write for certain people versus, you know, for a situation or for the public, or
right.
You can I guess I'm saying is that you can find your voice that way, really.
Exactly. And when people say, you know, that's the most important thing for a young composer is to find the voice, but to a certain extent, you know, you're not singing. It's your friends who are playing the viola who are doing, you know, and it's to a certain extent, it's exactly as you said, right? Where if you write for your friends, you learn how to tailor things in a way that makes it so that when you start writing for strangers, you've already got a couple steps. You're already a couple steps ahead because you've had the benefit of an honest working relationship with a practitioner. And you know, honestly, like I had such good friends at Juilliard who were willing to tell me that I was messing it up. And that's, I cannot tell you like how important, you know, my friend Nadia Sirota, who's a violist, but also kind of a great thinker about music, you know, she was very happy to say, let me show you why this is weird, you know, when I'm 20. Whereas, you know, and to a certain extent, I was very lucky to have singers who were willing to work with me in that way. So it's like by the time you get to writing a big scary opera, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're learning on the fly.
Right. Right.
Which, you know, and even someone saying like, by the way, that vowel is mad awkward on that note, and let me show you why. You're like, yeah, thank you. Like no one would tell you that. That's not in the book, right? And it's not something that, you know, and you can mess yourself up by studying like the wrong thing and being like, well, Beethoven did it, you know. And it's like, well, Beethoven did a lot of things, you know what I mean? Like, it's like,
oh. Well, so something that I wanted to focus on in the series as well, or address rather, is, you know, what this idea of revolutionary music is. So we talk about composers being revolutionary and music being revolutionary. And so I wanted to ask you first, do you think music can be revolutionary, and which composers would that resonate with for you, or which circumstances in which you found music to feel revolutionary in some way?
So this is actually, I was slightly anxious about the topic sentence of your show, because it's something that I feel really weird about, because it's, you know, I feel like I'm looking at it from the inside, first of all, and second of all, it's like, how many times have we turned on the radio and it's like Beethoven the Revolutionary, like,
exactly,
you know, right? And you think, you know, like, next, what I would say is that anytime that you think, let's use Beethoven as an example, you know, someone's a revolution, this changes everything, try to reimagine it immediately as a continuation of something else. Just see, right? And like, for instance, Stravinsky, early Stravinsky, you know, The Rite of Spring, good example, Firebird, Petrushka, even Symphony in E flat, all that stuff. You think, in all the ways it changed everything, it still has these roots, right, in Rimsky-Korsakov, right? It still has these things that are, you know, deny your parents as you might, you know, there's this genetic information that's still built into it, right? I know I sound like I'm like reciting the plot of Star Wars or something, but it's like there's this kind of, you know, anything that's a big change, I think always retains those roots that are in ways that are invisible until you see them, and then you can never look at them a different way. And for me, honestly, it was like thinking about the kind of batshit crazy structure of late Beethoven's piano sonatas, right? Where, you know, like Opus 111, where you think, you know, what is going on here? And then you kind of check back in kind of Mozartian, like, Fantasia world, and what's that? And what are, you know, what's happening, you know, a couple decades before that kind of presets just the ways in which you can always link things back. But what I also think is that the real importance of musical revolutionaries is what it does to the listener, right? What it does to you when you first hear it, and when it revolutionizes yourself, that's what it is. And for me, it was like listening to, for instance, Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich. I don't know, I must have been 15 years old. And it's like, was that piece revolutionary? Probably. Like, probably it changed everything, and probably it, you know, it had, and probably it wasn't. Like, probably it had stuff to do with what was happening in the past, and probably it had, you know, but for me, like, it changed me in a huge way. And that's kind of what matters more than, you know, than the kind of musicological analysis of like, you know, did this really shake everything up, right? And I'm speaking selfishly as a composer, but I also would encourage you, if you're a listener, and if you're being told that, for instance, you know, the ways in which, like, Shostakovich is a revolutionary, but Prokofiev isn't, or whatever, to think about what that music has done to you, right? And maybe it's the case that one of those Prokofiev toccatas, like you heard, like someone play it as an encore, and it just changed your entire world, right? In a way that Shostakovich never did. Or if for whatever reason you find that, that Bach doesn't revolutionize you in your full body, but Buxtehude does, or Schütz does, like embrace that. Like embrace what it does to you more so than kind of fussing over a sense of linearity and a twist to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and external expectations of what it should be.
Yeah, and I love that. I love that stuff. Like when I do like listening to the radio when it's like, let's do an hour-long focus on why Gesualdo was so crazy and why he wrote it. Yeah, I mean it's and again it's like, just because it's just been Beethoven year, you listen to a lot about Beethoven, and it's I'm trying to remember back. There's a wonderful anecdote about Morton Feldman talking about Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, and I think of Sibelius as something where, in my stupid mind when I was 18, I was like, Sibelius is this like old school whatever, I don't need to know this. Like I knew the violin concerto, like a stupid kid. And then my teacher, Christopher Rouse, of blessed memory, at that time told me, he was like, you're crazy. You have to listen to these symphonies like tonight. And when I heard that Seventh Symphony of Sibelius, that thing split my mind open like an egg, because the structure is so crazy. How it ends is so crazy. There's like this ritornello that makes absolutely no sense unless you think about it as a unbelievable expression of taking structure and doing this to it, even though it's like completely tonal music. So for me, that was a revolutionary piece for me. and whether or not Sibelius is like 50 years ahead of his time or 50 years behind his time, or whatever, like I don't care.
Yeah. And it was a revolutionary piece at that time for you as well.
Yeah, at that time when I was whatever it was, 21.
Well,
and you must find that too as an interpreter, where sometimes you're told that this person living at the same time as this person, it's actually this person who's the revolutionary, but you think, well, I don't, this thing changed me, like it's like,
oh, definitely. I'm on a major Grieg kick right now, which is so bizarre because I never thought I would fall in love with Grieg. I mean, but I am. But this is because he could master this very small form of the.
Are you singing those orchestra songs?
No, he has just Lieder for piano.
Lieder.
Yeah.
And
also
sorry, go ahead.
The lyric pieces as well for just solo piano. They're
so great.
They're perfect, really. And I never thought I would love Grieg. So
what got me into Grieg, actually, got me back into Grieg, was that Karita Matila recording of those orchestra songs. And I just remember you turn that thing on, and you think, okay. It's so, I mean, she's amazing, but again, it's like, if you pay too much attention in terms of pedagogy and in terms of this narrative sense of how music history works, which I've always tried to resist a little bit.
Yeah.
Not too much, because it's good to know everything, right? It's good to know actually how, the order of things, but it is a little weird when it starts to feel like, the Old Testament, where you're just like listing parents and children. and there always are these weirdos. And I think, again, I think about it in a really specific way in the Anglican tradition, right? Because that music existed in its own completely crazy bubble, really from the beginning of time, right? If you think about composers like Howells and Finzi and Tippett and Leighton and Matthias, there's all this stuff that exists in this completely bizarre islandy bubble. And it would be very easy to make an argument that, none of it really mattered, or it'd be very easy to make an argument within that tradition that this person was really changing everything. And I think it's really important to acknowledge both possibilities.
Right. Yeah, the grand, yeah, exactly. That's
and to remember that, you know, when people are 10 or 11 years old and you're singing in a choir and you hear some piece of Howells, that, you know, knowing full well that it was written, you know, not at the same time that you had Philip Glass, at the same time that you had, you know, I mean, the overlap is really interesting in the mid 20th century, right? Like, you would have already had 20 years of Cage, and then you have this like crazy meat and potatoes, you know, Magnificat Nunc Dimittis, and you think, but you know what, both of them can rock your world, revolutionary or not.
yeah, love it. Absolutely love it. Nico, we're actually out of time, and this was such a pleasure. I could just talk to you for
The pleasure
an
is
hour.
mine. Let's add that Carita Matula disc to our playlist.
Lovely idea. Yes, just to tell everyone, there's a playlist, an official playlist that Nico made, attached to the link for this episode today to accompany it. So thank you so much, Nico. It was such
The pleasure
a pleasure.
was totally mine. Thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone. See you next week.
Talk to you soon.